All right, guys. Today is part 2 of reading a book for 20 minutes every day to help me speak better. Today's book is Through a Window by Jane Goodall. Her 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gombe. I've never read this, or I haven't. I'm just starting it now, so I think we should just get into this. This is the book. Let's pose for a thumbnail. There we go. All right. Let me start the timer. All right. 20 minutes on the clock. Hold up. Hold up. Let me just restart. All right, here we go. All right. Chapter 1, Gombe. I rolled over and looked at the time, 5:44 a.m. Long years of early rising have led to an ability to wake just before the unpleasant clamor of an alarm clock. Soon as I was sitting on the steps of my house looking out over Lake Tanganyika, the waning moon in her last quarter was suspended above the horizon, where the mountainous shoreline of fringed Lake Tanganyika. It was a still night, and the moon's path danced and sparkled towards me across the gently moving water. My breakfast, a banana and a cup of coffee from the thermos flask, was soon finished, and 10 minutes later I was climbing the steep slope behind the house, my miniature binoculars and camera stuffed into my pockets, along with notebook, pencil stubs, a handful of raisins for my lunch, a plastic bag in which to put everything should it rain. The faint light from the moon shining on the dew-laden grass enabled me to find my way without difficulty, and presently I arrived at the place where the evening before I had watched 18 chimpanzees settle down for the night. I sat to wait until they woke. All around, the trees were still shrouded with the last mysteries of the night dreaming. It was very quiet, utterly peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a cricket and the soft murmur where the lake caressed the shingle way below. As I sat there, I felt the expectant thrill that for me always precedes a day with the chimpanzees, a day roaming the forest and mountains of Gombe, a day for new discoveries, new insights. Then came a sudden burst of song, the duet of a pair of robin chats. Hauntingly beautiful, I realized that the intensity of light had changed. Dawn had crept up me unawares. The coming brightness of the sun had all but vanished, the silvery, indefinite illumination of its own radiance reflected by the moon. The chimpanzees still slept. 5 minutes later came a rustling of leaves above. I looked up and saw branches moving against the lightning sky. That was where Goblin, top-ranked male of the community, had made his nest. Then stillness again. He must have turned over, then settled down for the last snooze. Soon after this, there was movement from another nest to my right. Then from one behind me further up the slope, rustling of leaves, then cracking of a little twig. The group was waking up, peering through my binoculars into the tree where Fifi had made a nest for herself and her infant Fiosi. I saw the silhouette of her foot. A moment later, Fanny, her 8-year-old daughter, climbed up from her nest nearby and sat just above her mother. A small dark shape against the sky, Fifi's other 2 offspring, adult Fruit and adolescent Frodo, had nested further up the slope. 9 minutes later, after he had first moved, Goblin abruptly sat up almost at once, left his nest, and began to leap wildly through the tree. Vigorously swaying the branches, instant pandemonium broke out. These chimpanzee The chimpanzees closest to the goblin left their nests and rushed out of his way. Others sat up to watch, tense and ready for the flight. The early morning peace was shattered by frenzied grunts and screams as Goblin's subordinates voiced their respect or fear. A few moments later, the arboreal part of his display over. Goblin leapt down and charged past me, slapping and stamping on the wet ground, rearing up and shaking in the vegetation, picking up and hurling a rock, an old piece of wood, another rock. Then he sat, hair bristling, some 15 feet away. He was breathing heavily. My own heart was beating fast. As he swung down, I had stood up and held onto a tree, praying that he would not pound on me as he sometimes does. Praying that he would not pound on me, yes. But to my relief, he had ignored me. And I sat down again. With soft, panting grunts, Goblin's younger brother, Gimbal, climbed down and came to greet the alpha, or top-ranking male, touching his face with his lips. Then as another adult male approached Goblin, Gimbal moved hastily out of the way. This was my old friend Everett. As he approached with loud, submissive grunts, Goblin slowly raised one arm in salutation, and Everett rushed forward. The two males embraced, grinningly widely in excitement of this morning's reunion, so that their teeth flashed white in the semi-darkness. For a few moments they groomed each other, and then calmed. Everett moved away and sat quietly nearby. The only other adult who climbed down then was Fifi. With Fiosi clinging to her belly, she avoided Goblin, but approached Everett gently, softly, reached out her hand and touched his arm. Then she began to groom him. Fiosi climbed into Everett's lap and looked up to his face. He glanced at her, groomed her head intently for a few moments, then turned to reciprocate Fifi's attentions. Fiosi moved halfway towards where Goblin sat, but his hair was still bristling, and she thought better of it and instead climbed a tree near Fifi soon as she began to play with Fanny, her sister. Once again, peace returned to the morning, though not the silence of dawn. Up in the trees, the other chimpanzees of the group were moving about, getting ready for the new day. Some began to feed, and I heard the occasional soft thud as skins and seeds of figs were dropped to the ground. I sat utterly content to be back at Gombe after an unusually long time away, almost 3 months of lectures, meetings, and lobbying in the USA and Europe. This would be my first day with the chimps, and I plan to enjoy it to the full. I just getting reacquainted with my old friend, taking pictures, getting my climbing legs back. It was Everett who led off 30 minutes later, twice pausing and looking back to make sure that Goblin was coming too. Fifi followed, Fiosi perched on her back like a small jockey, Fanny close behind. Now the other chimps climbed down and wandered after us. Frood and Frodo, adult males Atlas and Beethoven, the magnificent adolescent Wilkie, and the two females, Patty and Kiduv, with their infants. There were others, but they were traveling higher up in the slope, and I didn't see them then. We headed north, parallel with the beach below, then plunged down into the Kaselkela Valley, and with frequent pauses for feeding, made our way up to the opposite slope. The eastern sky grew bright, but not until 8:30 a.m. did the sun itself finally peep over the lake. The chimpanzees stopped and groomed for a while, enjoying the warmth of the morning sunshine. About 20 minutes later, there was a sudden outbreak of chimpanzee calls ahead, a mixture of pant hoots, as we call the loud distance calls, and screams. I could hear the distinct voice of the large, sterile female Gigi among the melody of females and youngsters. Goblin and Everett stopped grooming, and all the chimps stared towards the sound. Then, with Goblin now in the lead, most of the group moved off in that direction. Fifi, however, stayed behind and continued to groom Fanny, while Fiosi played by herself, dangling from a low branch near her mother and elder sister. I decided to stay too, delighted that Frito had moved on with the others, for he so often pesters me. He wants me to play, and because I will not, he becomes aggressive. At 12 years of age, he is much stronger than I am. And this behavior is dangerous. Once he stamped so hard on my head that my neck was nearly broken. And on another occasion, he pushed me down a steep slope, and I can only hope that as he matures and leaves childhood behind him, he will grow out of these irritating habits. I spend the rest of the morning wandering peacefully with Fifi and her daughters, moving from one food tree to the next. The chimps fed on several different kinds of fruit and once on some young shoots. For about 45 minutes, they pulled apart the leaves of the low shrubs, which had been rolled into tubes held closely by sticky threads, then munched on the caterpillars that wriggled inside. Once we passed another female gremlin and her new infant, little Galahad. Fanny and Fifi ran over to greet them, but Fifi barely glanced in their direction. All the time we were climbing higher and higher. Presently, on an open grassy ridge, we came upon another group of chimps, the adult male prof, his younger brother Pax, and two rather shy females with their infants. They were feeding on the leaves of massive mabula tree. There were a few quiet grunts greeting as Fifi and her youngsters joined the group. Then they also began to feed. Presently, the others moved on. Fanny with them, but Fifi made herself a nest and stretched out for a midday siesta. Fifi stayed too, climbing about, swinging, amusing herself near her mother. And then she joined Fifi in her nest, laying close and suckled. From where I sat below Fifi, I could look out over the Casacella Valley. Opposite to the south was the peak. A surge of warm memories flooded through me as I saw it. A rounded shoulder perched above the long grassy ridge that separates Casacella from the home valley, Kakombe. In early days of study at Gombe in 1960 and 1961, I had spent day after day watching the chimpanzees through my binoculars. From the superb vantage point, I had taken a little tin trunk up to the peak with a kettle, some coffee and sugar, and a blanket. Sometimes, when the chimps had slept nearby, I had stayed up there with them, wrapped in my blanket against the chill of the night air. Gradually, I had pieced together something of their daily life. A lot of talking about their feeding habits and travel routes, and begun to understand the unique social structure, small groups joining to form larger ones, large groups splitting into smaller ones, single chimpanzees rolling for a while on their own. From the peak I had seen for the first time a chimpanzee eating meat, David Graybeard. I had watched him leap up into a tree, clutching the carcass of an infant bush pig, which he shared with a female while the adult pigs charged about below. And only about 100 yards from the peak, on a never-to-be-forgotten day in October 1960. I'd watched David Graybeard, along with his close friends Goliath, fishing for termites with the stems of grass. Thinking back to that far-off time, I relived the thrill I had felt when I saw David reach out, pick a wide blade of grass, and trim it carefully so that it could be more easily poked into the narrow passage in the termite mound. Not only was he using the grass as a tool, he was modifying it into it to suit a special purpose, actually showing the crude beginnings of tool making. What excited telegrams I had set off to Louis Leakey, the far-sighted genius who had instigated the research at Gombe. Humans were not, after all, the only tool-making animals, nor were chimpanzees the placid vegetarians that people had supposed. 6 minutes, guys. That was just after my mother, Vane, had left to return to her other responsibilities in England. During her 4-month stay, she had made an invaluable contribution to the success of the project. She had set up a clinic, 4 poles and a thatched roof, where she provided medicines to the local people, mostly fishermen and their families. Although her remedies had been simple: aspirin, Epsom salts, iodine, band-aids, and so on. Her concern and patience had been unlimited, and her cures often worked. Much later, we learned that many people had thought that she possessed magic powers for healing. Thus she had secured for me the goodwill of local human population. Above me, Fifi stirred, cradling the little Fiosi more comfortably. As she suckled, then her eyes closed again. The infant nursed for a few more minutes, then the nipple slipped from her mouth as she too slept. I continued to daydream, reliving in my mind some of the most memorable events of the past. I remember the day when David Graybeard had his first visited my camp by the lake shore. He had come to feed on the ripe fruits of an oil nut palm that grew there, spied some bananas on the table outside my tent, and then taken them off to eat in the bush. Once he had discovered bananas, he had returned for more, and gradually other chimpanzees followed him to my camp. One of the females who became a regular visitor in 1963 was Fifi's mother, old Flo of raggedy ears and bulbous nose. What an exciting day when, after 5 years of maternal preoccupation with her infant daughter, Flo had become sexually attractive again. Flaunting her shell-pink sexual swelling, she had been attracted a whole between of suitors. Many of them had never been to camp, but they had followed Flo there, sexual passions overriding natural caution. And once they had discovered bananas, they had joined the rapidly growing group of regular camp visitors. And so I had become more and more familiar with the whole host of unforgettable chimpanzee characters who are described in my first book, In the Shadow of Man. Fifi, lying so peacefully above me now, was one of the few survivors in those early days. She had been an infant when I first knew her in 1961. She had weathered the terrible polio epidemic that had swept through the population, chimpanzee and human alike, in 1966. 10 of the chimpanzees of the study group had died or vanished. Another 5 had been crippled, including her eldest brother Fabin, who had lost the use of one arm. At the time of the epidemic, Gombe Stream Research Center was in its infancy. The first 2 research assistants were helping to collect a type out notes on chimp behavior. Some 25 chimpanzees were regular visiting camp by then. 3 minutes. And so there had been more than enough work for all of us. After watching the chimps all day, we had often transcribed notes from our tape recorders until late at night. My mother, Van, had made 2 other visits to Gombe during the 60s. One of those had been when the National Geographic sent Hugo Van Landwyk to film the study, which by then they were financing. Louis Leakey had wrangled Van's fare and expenses, insisting that it would not be right for me to be alone in the bush with a young man. How different than the moral standards of a quarter of a century ago. Hugo I had married anyway, and Anne's Van's 3rd visit in 1967 had been to share with me for a couple of months the task of raising my son, Grub, his real name Hugo Eric Lewis, in the bush. There was a slight movement from Fifi's nest, and I saw that she had turned and was looking down at me. What was she thinking? How much of the past did she remember? Did she ever think of her old mother, Flo? Had she followed the desperate struggle of her brother, Fegan, to rise up to the top-ranking alpha position? She had even been aware of the grim years when the males of her community, often led by Fegan, had waged a sort of primitive war against their neighbors, assaulting them one after the other with shocking brutality. Had she known about the gruesome cannibalistic attacks made by Passion and her adult daughter Pom on newborn infants of the community. Again, my attention was jerked back to the present, this time by the sound of chimpanzee crying. I smiled. That would be Fanny. She had reached the adventurous age when a young female often moves away from her mother to travel with the adults. Then suddenly she wants mother desperately leaves the group and sets off to search for her. The crying grew louder and soon Fanny came into sight. Fifi paid no attention, but Fiosi jumped out of the nest and scrambled down to embrace her elder sister, and Fanny, finding Fifi where she had left her, stopped her childish crying. Clearly, Fifi had been waiting for Fanny. Now she climbed down and set off, and the children followed her, playing as they went. The family moved rapidly down the steep slope to the south. As I scrambled after them, every branch seemed to catch in my hair or my shirt. Frantically, I crawled and wiggled through a terrible tangle of undergrowth. Ahead of me, the chimpanzee's fluid black shadows moved effortlessly. The distance between us increased. The vines curled. Golly, bro. Oh my gosh. Where was I? Ahead of me, the chimpanzee's fluid black shadows moved effortlessly. The distance between us increased. The vines curled around the buckles of my shoes and the straps of my camera. The thorns caught in the flesh of my arms. My eyes smarted till the tears flowed as I yanked my hair from the snags that reached out from all around. After 10 minutes, I was drenched in sweat. My shirt was torn. My knees bruised from crawling on the stony ground, and the chimps had vanished. I kept quiet still, not trying to listen above the pounding of my heart, peering in all directions through the thicket around me, but I heard nothing. All right, we're gonna stop there. I'll just use this thing. All right, remember, it's called Jane Goodall, Through a Window by Jane Goodall. This book, I don't even know what to think of this book, to be honest. I like it. It has a lot of like hard words, I guess you could say. But overall, it's gonna help me in the long run because as you could tell, I wasn't really like, I was pretty struggling through it. So anyway, thank you for watching. Subscribe to see my journey through this. Go check out my earliest video. I guess. Bye.